story of love.
Tell it to me again.
Wonderful story of love.
Wake the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it. Shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love.
Wonderful story of love.
Though you are far away,
Wonderful story of love.
still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, e'en from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love.
Wonderful story of love.
Jesus provides a rest
Wonderful story of love.
for all the pure and blessed. Rest in those mansions above us, with those who've gone on before us, singing the rapturous chorus. Wonderful story of love. 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 I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Through this world of toil and snares, if I falter, Lord, who cares? Who with me my burden shares? None but thee, dear Lord, none but thee.
You'll turn to the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 1 was part of last week's reading schedule. I have an affinity for the wisdom literature. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, those books are rich with information about godliness and life and how we should look at things and live. And so I want to take a little bit of time this evening looking at this first chapter of Ecclesiastes, which kind of introduces, I guess, the theme of the book and sets forth the basic principles in which this writing examines. It opens up the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? Vanity of human endeavors. That's really what this introduction is all about. The theme of this book is the vanity and the cyclical nature of the material world and living in that material world. Human efforts human achievements, the things that we produce, the things that we originate, the things that we come up with, these things are ultimately meaningless. What does a man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun is the question. And the answer to that is this vanity. He doesn't gain anything from the things that he toils at under the sun. That is not the pursuits that are going to bring about success in life. We can amass the wealth of the world. We can take control over all the landmass of the world. And there have been men who that was their goal. That was their dream, to be the supreme ruler controlling the whole earth. Kings have sought to do that throughout history. And they amass wealth, and they build armies, and they conquer territories, and more often than not render much destruction in the process of trying to accomplish that, because other people tend to not want them to gain control over them. And in the end, these men die, and these kingdoms die, and this wealth that was amassed goes away, and the power and the control dissipates, and there's nothing left to show for it. There is no Assyrian nation any longer. There's no Babylonian nation any longer. The imperialist Greek nation is no more. The imperialist Roman nation is no more. The imperialist British nation is no more. And if the earth continues long enough, there'll be a day in which people will say there is no America any longer. So the human efforts, human achievements, the work that we do in this material world, and that's what the idiomatic phrase under the sun refers to. They ultimately don't amass to anything. And this should cause us to reflect upon ourselves, to reflect upon the repetitive patterns that we see in the world around us. And he's going to kind of go into that in just a moment in a comparison section. These things that just happen, and then they end, and then they happen again, and then they end, and then they happen again. That's the nature of the material world. We observe in nature and in our material earthly existence these repetitive things that all total to nothing. That's what the word vanity means. Pointless. And yet, for so many people, that is the only thing that life is about. The only thing that life is about is here and now. The only thing that life is about is where I am, is my station, is my place, is my wealth, is my whatever. They're worried about their jobs, they're worried about their houses, they're worried about their cars, being the biggest and the best, and having bragging rights, and having influence, and having power. And the writer here says, when you get to the end of life's journey, all of that toil that you put in under the sun, you find out is useless. The wealthiest, most powerful man in the world will not be spared death because of his wealth and power. Sometimes, apparently, they think that way. They think that they ought to be able to buy their life. But alas, they determine that they cannot. And so the writer continues as he talks about the insignificance of human achievements. And he does that in a comparative way. It's really an interesting discussion. And it goes from verse 4 all the way to verse 11. A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with the seeing, nor the ear filled with the hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has been already in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of latter things yet to be among those who come after. This is a discussion that's really about the transient nature of human accomplishments. The toil of our labor on this earth under the sun ultimately is temporary. And we strive to achieve these great things, and you hear people interviewed on the news or these interview shows. What are you trying to accomplish? And well, I want to make my mark. I want to change things for the better. Everybody's always trying to change things for the better, by the way. Nobody ever says, I want to change things for the worse. They're always trying. Now, it doesn't matter how many people they hurt along the process of trying to change. They're always trying to change things for the better. And they want to make their mark in the world and change the world. And he says that's not a real pursuit. There's nothing new. There's nothing that's going to be different than anything that has come before. Just like the sun rises and sets and then rises again and then sets again and then rises again. That's the way life on earth is. Just like the water runs down the streams and goes into the rivers, and the rivers empty into the sea, and then they get evaporated out of the sea and make clouds and come back onto the land and rain down upon the land and make the streams once again, and the streams run into the rivers and the rivers run into the... It just keeps the same thing over and over again. This is a similar discussion to what James says in two short verses. In James chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go into such and such a town and spend a year there and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What's your life? You're a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. And that's not just talking about our physical presence on the earth, although that's part of it. That's true, that we are physically present on the earth only for a short period of time, and then we die and we are no more. But it's also true about all that we do. When we talk about this passage in James, I very often bring up Joseph and the huge impact that Joseph had on the world at the time, and particularly in Egypt at the time, in delivering them from that horrible 7-year famine and making certain that they had food and they were able to feed all of the Egyptians and able to feed the neighboring nations around them as well. And he was noted and he was glorified and his family was brought in and they were given the best lands to live in. And then a Pharaoh arose who knew not Joseph. And all of that work was forgotten about. That is the way life is. And so if we're striving, if that's the primary purpose of our life, we're being told up front, you're not doing anything that people before you haven't done. Nothing that you're going to accomplish is any different than the things that have already been accomplished by people before you, or that will be accomplished after you, if there is an after you. And you will never live for all history. You will be forgotten. People in this nation have already forgotten the things that we will never forget. The Great War. There might be people sitting in this room that don't even know what I'm making reference to when I say the Great War. That's World War I. We can't name the battles of World War I. We can't talk about what happened in World War I because we've forgotten about it. Then there was the Second World War. That was the war to end all wars. Only problem is we've had several more wars since the war to end all wars. And we've forgotten about the great battles of that war and the heroes of that war. And the things that we remember some names, especially if they're those names that we talk about all the time, or names that are associated with the faces that are on our money. We remember those people. We remember George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and Ben Franklin, and, well, maybe we don't remember U.S. Grant as much. But we remember the names, but many of us would be hard-pressed to actually say what they accomplished, because those things are forgotten. That is what he's talking about. This is a comparison of human endeavors to what appears to be the permanency of nature itself. Look at verse 4. A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. And so that past generation, the people that were before me, well, they're gone. They're in the rearview mirror now. We can forget about them. Now we've got the coming generation. Oh, I'm not, I guess I'm part of the exiting generation now. I keep forgetting that I'm getting older. And the younger folks today, the 20-somethings and 30-somethings look at people of my generation and say, well, they're we're the up and coming. We're the ones that are. But his point is a generation goes and a generation comes, and that happens generation after generation after generation. Every generation is eventually the outgoing generation. But there's this appearance that the world endures. And I say an appearance because we know that the earth will not last forever. And so this is not actually a literal point that's being made. In 2 Peter chapter 3, for instance, he talks about the scoffers that come with their scoffing and their sinful desires and all of that sort of stuff. He talks about the promise of the Lord. He talks about the fact that the Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise. And then he says this, the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved. The heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, the stars, all of those things that we see in the universe, he says, are going to be burned up and dissolved. The earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. Since all these things are to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in the lives of holiness and godliness? Okay, so the end of this material universe is that it is ultimately going to be destroyed. It's going to be done away with. Material things are going to cease. And so he's not saying that the earth remains forever in a literal sense. It's a comparative thing. The earth remains forever as it's compared to a generation of man on it. We are but a vapor that appears but for a little while and then vanishes away. He's emphasizing the futility of striving for lasting significance in a world that ultimately is, by its nature, not permanent. Look down in verse 11, where this section ends. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of latter things. You remember this starts with a generation goes and a generation comes. He says, look, we forget what the generation that goes has done, but don't think that the generation that's come is going to be remembered anymore. There's not going to be any remembrance of latter things either. It is a transient existence on this earth. And so when we store up for ourselves treasures on earth, where that is where our passions lie, when that is where our goals are, when that is all that we are consumed by, we are focusing on things that are doomed to vanish. And that is, of course, the same thing that the Lord taught, right? He talked about those things as being those things which the moth and the rust could destroy, where thieves could break in and steal things. He said, don't store up for yourselves treasure on earth, where that is the end of these things, but instead store for yourselves treasures in heaven. Focus on things that have inherent value. And those things are not part of this material world, because the material world is just a cyclical thing that comes and goes like the sun, like the water cycle. As he moves on in this chapter, from about 12 to 18, he is talking about the pursuit of wisdom and knowledge. Now, this is an interesting type of wisdom and knowledge, and it's going to, I think, be apparent. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I've seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, and surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly, and I perceived that this also is but striving after the wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. The examination of the inherent human pursuit of wisdom as a means for man to find meaning in life. That's what's going on here. That's what he's talking about in verses 12 and 13. That there is this aspect of man that is constantly seeking to know. And if the acquisition of earthly wisdom, material knowledge, is all that consumes us, that's going to prove to be empty to us as well. That's what he's saying here. I've known people who were in their 30s, their mid-30s, when I knew them, and they were still in college, working on their 4th or 5th degree. Just because they were looking for more knowledge. Probably also because they were trying to avoid living in the adult world, but that's another story. That kind of thing ultimately will never produce a meaningful life. We need to recognize the limitations of human understanding. That's what he's talking about in verses 14, 15. I've seen everything that's done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. There are limitations to what natural knowledge and understanding can do. Is there profit to it? Absolutely. Medical science is testimony to the profit to it. Lifespans are increasing compared to what they were a few hundred years ago because we have learned some things. Now, I can turn that on its head and say that historically, lifespans at one time were much longer than they are today, and maybe that's because we forgot some things. But there is some value in learning. There is some value in knowing. There is some value in understanding, but there isn't all value in that. And ultimately, once you see all that there is to see, he says, I found that to be striving after the wind as well. What is crooked cannot be made straight. I don't care how much a man learns, he's never going to fix the problems that are on the earth. That is the futility of governments. They think that they can fix all of our problems and create a utopian existence, and it can't be done. That is striving after the wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. We will never get everything. There'll always be something that can't be counted. We have to recognize those limitations and acknowledge the frustration that is inherent in seeking those ultimate answers which are beyond human comprehension. We're not going to find the solution to our own problems. That's the point. I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly, and I perceived that this also is but striving after the wind. In fact, he says, in much wisdom comes vexation, trouble, sorrow, grief, pain. In much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. That's not going to... The information that man needs to know isn't generated from man's work under the sun. The information that man needs to know is given to us by God. And he is capturing what becomes really the central theme for this entire book. He then spends a lot of time delving more deeply into these things and seeking to explain more fully why these things are so. But we need to understand the insignificance of human achievements and the pursuit of human wisdom in the face of life's mysteries. I know a lot of discontented people in the world, and their discontent leads them to make some really bad choices and draw some really poor conclusions about how they should live and act and think about this world. It arises from discontent, from vexation and frustration, from pain and from sorrow, and those things are only increased when we are focused on ourselves and on the here and now. And the general belief by so many people that if only I had a little more, all of my problems would go away, is met with the reality that having a little more only brings more problems. That's essentially what he said. In much wisdom is much vexation. Put anything in there you want. It really doesn't matter. You can say in much power is much vexation. That's why U.S. presidents age so much in the 4 years that they sit in the White House. You can say in much wealth there is vexation. People's problems don't go away just because they have a big bank account. In fact, usually that just creates bigger problems for them. It doesn't really matter. In much partying, he kind of delves into that, the appeasement of the flesh. In much partying, there is vexation. For every great night of drinking, there's the next morning of misery. It doesn't go away because you obtain much of this earth. It just makes you more aware of the problem. And so eventually he shifts us. By the time we get to the end of this book, which will be read later this week, we'll get to chapter 12 in a few days. And he says, at the end of the matter, all has been heard. When he gets to the end of this book, he's examined all the big blocks of earthly pursuit and desire that man has. And he says, all of it's now been heard. We've looked at all of them. We found them all to be vain. He said, this is what's left. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. That is the only place to find true satisfaction, true contentment, and true hope. And then the warning, for God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Being aware of the impending judgment of God. You want to know something that makes you wise? Being aware of the impending judgment of God. Understanding that you will give an account of the choices that you have made, whether good or evil. There is no morality apart from God. There is no hope apart from God. There is no real understanding apart from God, because in the pursuit of human understanding, you eventually just get to the point that you realize this is striving after the wind. And that's what this book is trying to get us to see. But before we make the mistakes of so many people who have gone before us, before we make the mistakes of Nebuchadnezzar, before we make the mistakes of Saul, King Saul, or young Jewish student Saul, who thought he had to do many things contrary to the way of Christ. Before we go down those roads and find ourselves as an old man looking back on a life that was spent on vanity and striving after the wind and regretting our use, he's saying, learn it today and start looking to God for meaning, for direction, for hope. By the way, that's the joy that the Apostle Paul eventually found, right? It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. He learned to no longer pursue those things that he once pursued. He could have been somebody. He was from the right kind of family. He was from the right sect of Judaism. He had the right teachers. He had the ear and the respect of the right people. And he learned, you know what? That is nothing but dung. It's refuse that I cast off for the supreme value of knowing Christ Jesus. And there's where the true value in life is. What does man gain? Man gains nothing for his work done under the sun. But for the things that he invests in the spiritual realm of the heavenly places with God, there's great gain. Let us determine that is where our pursuits will lie. And that is the measure of success that we seek. Well done, my good and faithful servant. Enter into the glories of your master. If we can help you in any way, let it be known as we stand and sing. I hear
Wonderful story of love.
Tell it to me again.
Wonderful story of love.
With the immortal strain, angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love.
Wonderful story of love.
Though you are far away,
Wonderful story of love.
still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain. He from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love.
Wonderful story of love.
Jesus provides a rest
Wonderful story of love.
for all the pure and blessed. Rest in those mansions above us, with those who've gone on before us, singing the rapturous chorus. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story